And it is my distinct pleasure, actually, at this moment now to introduce to you the distinguished professor of practice, my colleague, Professor Ronald de Jong from Tilburg University. As we turn, and all of you have been very patient, it's a long webinar, but if we turn from the ideas of science, the question that we really need to ask is how do we put this into practice? And one thing that I think that everybody hears on this webinar shares is that people speak from the heart, people speak with honesty, and people also speak with humility. And Professor Ronald, it has been an incredible pleasure for me to attend your lectures. When you come to the university and you lecture, and especially when that lecturing is not online, but is actually face-to-face, the halls fill up and students flock in. Because I think that our young people, that is, I think, the experience that you have shown when you lecture, that our young people, they want to contribute. And so your lectures on sustainable leadership are among the most popular. And I think this is so because they are very, very insightful. And it's a big honor for me to give you the floor and to enlighten us with how we can move from a state of helplessness into a place where we can all take responsibility. I look forward to hearing your presentation, Ronald.
Thank you, Mirjam, Professor Van Rijssen, Honorable President Sharon Bira of the African Union, professors, excellencies, distinguished guests, all protocols observed. Let me start by sharing a couple of personal reflections before I guide you through my slides, if you allow me. In his opening words, the President of the African Union shared with us a couple of his reflections upon the big, complex, wicked issues of our times. And he shared his thought that underlying these big, complex challenges very often are principles like inequality, inequity, and unfairness. Access to vaccination was given as an example, and it was the very start of our initiatives to write the letter to Dr. Tedros and Dr. Borrell. But I could add access to basic healthcare, access to education, access to clean water, access to safe food. And the president also mentioned solidarity between all people on all continents as a potential solution to address these challenges. I think that subsequent speakers that we have listened to have substantiated the points made by President Sharon Bira based upon their specific examples and their specific use cases. In my contribution, I would like to reflect upon the need for leadership, and I will try to demystify that notion a little bit, as libraries have been written about leadership for decades and even centuries. One of the points that I'm going to make is that I think that the developments in society and the resulting challenges and wicked issues that we face run the risk of outpacing our wisdom and pose a serious challenge upon our leadership. One of the aspects in leadership is turning statements of intent into action, action that yields results and that drives impact. In that sense, the Sustainable Development Goals are not more than 17 statements of intent that will require leadership to materialize. Now, let me, before I go into the slides, share two thoughts on the key theme of our conference, which is the role of the EU and the role of the African Union. And let me start with the EU. The EU is the largest economy in the world. It's bigger than that of the United States of America. It's been bigger than that of China. That gives it the resources that would be required to drive systemic change. But more importantly, the EU is a community of values. And that gives us the moral obligation to leverage those resources to drive system change. So my contribution is very much a call for leadership and responsible leadership within the European leaders to leverage their economic power base and show that the values upon which the EU was based really can be turned into a force for good. For the African Union, I have a very clear wish, and that is that leaders on the African continent empower themselves to take their rightful place on the world stage. The African continent is where humanity originated from. It is going to be the most populated continent on the planet. It will have the youngest population, already today it has. And it is very resource rich. And it is sad that recently many oil wells have been discovered on the African continent, and that the exploration of these oil wells is complicated by the fact that we are facing climate change as humanity, and for that reason we are banning fossil fuels. But let me provide the perspective that was given by previous speakers. With the population that you have on the continent and the demographics of that population, you have data. And data is the new oil. Data is going to be, when used wisely, and that's why I so strongly support the principles of data ownership on the continent and in the communities. It is going to be the source for sustainable development going forward. With those reflections, I would like to dive into my presentation and ask Clara to show the first slide. And that is what I go, the model of all graphs. It's substantiating basically the point that I made. We see a world population that, according to the United Nations, is growing very fast and rapidly. Predictions show that we will have somewhere between 10, 11, maybe 13 billion people on the planet in the year 2000. But half of that, in the most optimistic scenario, is going to be on the African continent. This substantiates my point that Africa is an important place. More important than we currently would, let's say, distill when reflecting upon geopolitical balances and discussions between the various known suspects as the EU, China, Russia, and the United States. But this graph substantiates the opportunity that African continent has to play a big part on the world stage. Second slide shows the big challenges that also President Sharon Bira had been referring to. The complex challenges that we face as humanity, be it energy consumption, aging populations, access to education, air pollution, and these challenges are complex and interdependent. But what I would like to point out, and that is what the next slide shows, is that the pandemic, that was the very trigger for our conference, has complicated things quite dramatically. And maybe you can just show the slide in full, Clara, because we see that the Oxfam report that was just coming out a couple of weeks ago has shown that many of the issues that we face on the world stage have been aggravated quite dramatically. And I highlighted a section that is, I think, relevant in the context of this conference, and that is that inequality between countries is expected to rise for the first time in a generation, where especially developing countries are denied access to sufficient vaccines because the rich governance protection of pharmaceutical corporations has led to an allocation that is unfair, not equal, and unjust. So where we already had issues in terms of unfairness, inequality, and inequity, as the president pointed out, these have only been aggravated as a consequence of the pandemic. Couple of more data points not related to health, but to climate change, you can see on the next slide. The African continent is accountable for less than 3% of greenhouse gas emissions, but it faced more than $38 billion in damages due to climate change over the last years. Only 2% of all global investments in energy transition went into Africa. And defunding the fossil fuel projects that I was referring to are devastating for the African economy unless we find a way to, for instance, monetize the data that is going to be the new currency on the continent. I would like in the next slide to put the COVID crisis a little bit into perspective, because the world has been basically in the ban of COVID over the last 2 years. But this could turn out to be the smaller of issues over the times. There are many signs that we might be facing a recession with inflation that is creeping up, with global debt that has reached unprecedented heights, and that will become unsustainable the moment that interest rates are going to be increased. And also there we have seen first signs. Climate change is known, as well as biodiversity collapse that could threaten humanity. On the next slide, you see that there are, as a consequence, many unknowns. I mean, David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, said a couple of weeks ago that the world economy is facing, next to COVID-19, inflation and policy uncertainty, where the enormous spending of governments and monetary policies have brought us into uncharted territory. We don't know yet what the impact of biodiversity loss will be on long term, how effective climate adaptation measures will be. And I refer to the enormous damages that the African continent has already been suffering. The intergenerational equity concerns when it comes to decision making, but also how we should feed the world population a healthy diet within planetary boundaries. And the list goes on and on and on. Now, fortunately, we have the Sustainable Development Goals as a kind of set of guiding principles. But as I said before, these will remain statements of intent unless we apply leadership to turning them into action and yielding results. I shared with you that leadership is a concept that everybody has an opinion about and that libraries have been written about. But a definition that I very much like is that responsible leaders build and cultivate sustainable relationships with stakeholders to achieve mutually shared objectives based upon a vision that these relationships need to yield results that benefit the many. I think that call for leadership is an important one. And in my personal view, I think we need leaders that put next level interest above their own. Leaders that really unite around a common set of goals and overcome their differences. That goes for the European Union, it goes for the African Union. You should be aware and self-confident about your position on the world stage and the geopolitical responsibility that implies. And embrace good governance, ethical, fair, and driven by the desire to do good. Above all, and that is often forgotten, we all aspire to be leaders, but leaders are leading instead of following. And that means they create new realities. They shape the future by challenging and changing the status quo. So I guess that I would like to close off with a call for action formulated as a question. Question to European leaders, being aware of their responsibility as the biggest economy in the world and being a community of values, as well as African leaders, representing the place where humanity originated from, the continent with the largest population, with a very favorable demographics, and with fast resources to drive the systemic change needed. Empower yourself and make sure that you drive the change that we need in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ronald, for a really challenging appeal to all of us that leadership starts with awareness and awareness of our own power, actually, to to lead change.